Welcome to our video lecture on innate and learned behaviors. Our essential understanding for today is that behavioral patterns can be inherited or learned. Our objectives: we are going to define and describe examples of innate behavior. Innate behaviors are those that can be inherited. Some examples include palmar grasp reflex, taxis and kinesis, fixed action patterns. We're also going to look at the anatomy of a reflex arc. We're going to define and describe examples of learned behavior, including imprinting, reflex conditioning, which is sometimes referred to as classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. We're going to explain how birdsong is both innate and learned, and then we're going to describe the process of making memories. Vocab to look at real quick before we get going. So behavior is any observable action by a living organism. It's usually in response to a stimulus. So a stimulus is any change in the environment that triggers that response, and then the response is the action of the muscle. We're going to focus a little bit more on actions of muscles today. These behaviors can be innate. They are inherited, they're genetic, they are independent of the environment or the experience, literally in our DNA. And then we also have some behaviors that are learned, and these are gained or modified due to interactions or experiences in our environment with other organisms. So we're going to look at lots of examples of innate behaviors first, and then we're going to flip over to learned behaviors later. So one cool thing about innate behaviors, because they are genetic, because they are inherited, they can change over time with evolution, but we know that evolution tends to move pretty slowly. So these behaviors are sometimes remnants of our very long ago past. One example is the palmar grasp reflex. So all primates do this. If you put your finger or thumb into the hand of an infant, that baby will grab on and hold on super tight. Other primates that have more fur are going to use this palmar grasp reflex to carry their babies around. So tiny chimpanzees will hold on to moms and then get carried around because this palmar grasp reflex is so crazy strong. Us humans, we still have remnants of this reflex, even though we don't have the fur anymore. And so this is just one of those leftovers of a common ancestor from long ago. Kind of a cool thing. So if you're around an infant, check out their palmar grasp reflex. So we can study the innate behaviors of other animals either in labs or in the field. So field studies are pretty cool. We can actually observe organisms in their natural states, which is cool. One of the challenges is that we have to kind of get hopeful that the behaviors that we're looking for will actually be observed while we're hanging out in the field, hoping to see things. Another quirky little deal about field studies: what if us humans being in the field actually changes how the other animals behave? So are field studies really field studies, or are they also labs because we have inserted ourselves into the fields? I don't know. Labs are super cool because we can control lots of variables, and so it sometimes makes it a little bit easier to collect data. But of course, now we're observing behaviors that are in a lab, not in a natural environment, and so we're not sure how relevant those behaviors might actually be. So two kinds of behavior, innate behavior, that we can study in a lab, and we are actually going to do this lab, are taxis and kinesis. So taxis is movement toward or away from a stimulus. So if I turned on a light, big shiny light, and I had a roly-poly here, and it didn't like the light and it moved away from the light, this would be an example of taxis, because it's moving away from that stimulus. Kinesis is also movement, but it's not necessarily toward or away from anything. Ooh, ignore that. We're going to watch that video in class. So in kinesis, what's going to happen is there's going to be movement. It'll be random movement, not necessarily toward or away, but there will be a difference in the movement. For example, if I put roly-polies in a wet environment, in a dry environment, in the dry environment, they tend to just stand still. In the wet environment, they think there's food, and so they wander around a whole lot more. So the fact that there's simply more movement, not necessarily toward or away from anything, but they're just moving more, is an example of kinesis. So another example of innate behavior is a fixed action pattern. These are like a series of behaviors, and once the series starts, the organism cannot stop. So these birds, if they notice an egg out of the nest, they are going to grab it and they're going to roll it back into their nest. And this fixed action pattern, once it's initiated, once this bird spots this egg outside, it's going to roll it in no matter what. Even if it gets to the egg and the bird's like, oh, this is a rock, it's still going to roll it into the nest because it has initiated this fixed action pattern. Once this series of events gets started, there's no stopping it. We're going to look at the anatomy of a reflex arc. So if you've ever had a physical, the doctor, they hammer your knee just a little bit. And what's happening is there's nerves in here. Those nerves are sending a stimulus to your spinal cord. Then your spinal cord sends a response back to the muscle, and then you move. These are autonomic. There is no brain processing, brain thought involved. In fact, the processing happens right here in the spinal cord. We do also send a signal to the brain, and your brain is like, oh, that hurt, and I kicked. But you kick before your brain even knows that you're kicking. It's involuntary, you can't stop it, and it's super fast because, again, we don't have to process in the brain. Spinal cord, it's all done. We're going to look a little bit more closely at this idea of autonomic control. So central nervous system, we know, is brain and spinal cord. Comes from the neural tube that develops because of the notochord during differentiation, that embryonic neurulation. The peripheral nervous system, these are everything outside the brain and spinal cord. Definitely the peripheral system communicates with the central nervous system. Two different kinds of peripheral nervous system divisions. We have our sensory, getting input from the environment. It's going to send signals to the central nervous system. And then the motor or efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, and this is going to be our motor neurons. Signals go from the brain through the peripheral nervous system to the motor neurons, and then we're going to do things. These motor neurons can be either autonomic, that's what we're talking about today, or they can be somatic. Somatic nervous system is going to be controlling voluntary movement, so the things that you choose to do, the things that your brain says, I'm going to do this now, as opposed to autonomic nervous system, not in your control, it just happens. And a couple different things. We have the sympathetic division. This is fight or flight responses, is going to get things motivated, moving up in rate and energy levels, heart rate up, breathing rate up. And then we have parasympathetic division, which is going to be that rest and digest, slow things down. If we're talking about heart rate, remember that this is going to be the accelerator nerve, is going to get our heart rate to move a little bit more quickly. And then on the opposite side, the parasympathetic is our vagus nerve, is going to slow that heart rate down. So here we're talking about autonomic, and so it just happens. And we're going to have pain withdrawal reflex is what we're going to look at. So let's say that you stepped on a pin, and so those mechanoreceptors in your skin are going to notice this pain. That receptor is going to send a signal through the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is sometimes also called the afferent neuron. We're going to send this signal to the spinal cord. Notice that so ganglion is just like any groups of, especially cell bodies, like we had the ganglion cells in the retina. So this is just like the clump in the spinal cord where the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are kind of collected. We're going to send that signal into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, we have these super short relay neurons. Sometimes they're also called interneurons. So that signal is going to come from the sensory organ, those mechanoreceptors in the skin, through that sensory neuron to the interneuron. The interneuron is going to process what needs to be done and send a signal to the motor neuron. Motor neuron cell body is here in the spinal cord. We're going to have this crazy long ventral root, is just like the chunk of the back where all these axons are collected. And we're going to send that signal through the motor neuron to the effector, and so this sometimes is also called the efferent neuron, to the effector, where the effect, cause, effect. where the effect is going to take place, and that's going to be, we're going to move our muscles to get away from the pain. So you're going to pick your foot up, or if you touch a hot stove, you're going to move your hand really fast. And again, all of this happens right here. Sensory neuron, spinal cord, motor neuron. We do also send a signal to the brain that says, hey, that hurt. But again, you have moved this muscle away from the pain before your brain processes that you're in pain. So this is super fast and helps just to keep us alive. So practice really quickly. Find the pieces and parts of the reflex arc here. Pause the video and then start it again to check your answers. All right, so hopefully you realize that this little neuron in the middle of the spinal cord is our relay neuron, also called the interneuron. Whoa, if I could spell interneuron. This guy, because we're coming from receptors in the skin, this one's going to be our sensory neuron. It's receiving information from the skin, the mechanoreceptors or the thermoreceptors in the skin. So this is our sensory neuron, sometimes also called our afferent neuron. And then, of course, here's our effector or motor neuron. It didn't ask you to label that, but we have our motor neuron, and it's going to send that signal to the muscle, the effector. This part of the question is asking us to draw an arrow to show the direction, and we're of course going to take the information from the receptors in the skin. We're going to go this way through the sensory neuron, through the interneuron or the relay neuron, and then out the motor neuron to the muscle. Good? Good. All right, so now we're going to flip over to some learned behaviors, and it's all about interactions and experiences in our environment, and these are super quick to change. So those innate behaviors change slowly over time due to evolution. These guys, like, you learn things crazy fast and you change up those behaviors really, really fast. So one example of a learned behavior that is also innate is bird songs. So baby birds are born with some genetic pieces that allow them to recognize their song and also to sing their song. So different species have different songs. These are genetically programmed. However, there are some learned pieces of their songs that allow for individual recognition. And so what usually happens is the father bird will sing the song. The babies are born with some recognition of the song, but then specifics to their own little family are learned when the father bird sings to all the baby birds. We can actually measure our birdsong learning patterns using sonograms. So sonograms look kind of like this, and lower sounds are low on the graph and high sounds are high on the graph, and things that go like up and down like a little trill in the bird song would be up and down really fast. If they go ooh, that would look like that. And so just imagine these are lower sounds, these are higher sounds, and the bird songs are going up and down and up and down. And we can look at these patterns in the sonograms, and we can see some similarities and some differences already. So everybody kind of starts with something low, and there's this little dip, and there's a little dip, and there's a little dip, but the dips are not all quite the same, and the width of the low sound isn't all the same, but timing is pretty similar. They all start low, and then everybody has this big trill thing, right? And then there's that up and down, up and down, up and down. Not all the same, but super similar. So on an IB exam, you might see a question kind of like this. So we have this comparing, so the sonogram 3 is a bird that was away from other birds. Poor baby, can you imagine growing up with no one singing to you? So anyhow, this baby was born, reared alone, no bird songs in its youth. Compare 3 with 1 and 2. This is kind of what we just did. They all start low. There's definitely some similarities. There is a trill here. There's some similarities. There's a lot of ups and downs, lots of ups and downs. throughout all of these patterns. And so when we discuss whether birdsong is innate learned or both, we can say both, because there are lots of similarities, sonogram 3 to 1 and 2, but there are also some pieces that are very different. This little trill at the end, it's a very sad trill at the end. So we can talk about how it is innate. Clearly the bird was born knowing pieces of the song, but there were pieces that it didn't learn, which is why there are differences between 3 and 1 and 2. And so birdsong learning is both innate behavior and learned behavior. And the reason that 1 and 2 are different is because these birds were from different parts of the environment, and so they're from different families. Same species, different families. So imprinting is another example of a learned behavior. The scientist Konrad Lorenz is kind of like the discoverer and describer of imprinting. And so he worked with baby geese and found that there is a critical period shortly after hatching where these geese imprint on some parent figure. And usually it is actually the mom goose who sat on the eggs. But in Dr. Lorenz's investigation, he became the mama goose. And so imprinting is also like birdsong, both innate and learned. There's some genetic piece that leads to that critical period, but then the learned part is who is the mama goose. And so these baby geese would follow Dr. Lorenz around just like they should have followed their mom. It is permanent. If Dr. Lorenz put the actual mama goose in after that critical period, didn't matter. The baby geese would still follow him around. And interestingly, it's permanent even if there isn't a benefit. There really isn't a benefit to these geese following Dr. Lorenz around, except he did feed them, so I guess that was a benefit. But this imprinting is also like birdsong, both innate and learned. Reflex conditioning, which is sometimes also known as classical conditioning, is Pavlov's investigation. So this is all about creating new associations for reflexes that already exist. So this was an innate response. So the smell of the food led to the dog drooling. We called this unconditioned because this stimulus led to this response. It was innate. What happened was that Pavlov added a bell to the food. And so he would ring a bell. If he didn't give the dog food with the bell led to no drooling. But for a long time, the bell and the food were given together. So ring the bell, feed the food, ring the bell, feed the food. The dog would drool because of the food. But then, because it started to associate bell and food, we could ring the bell and get the drool even without the food. So this is reflex conditioning, where the investigator created a new association with a reflex that already was innate. Pavlov, of course, famous for this investigation. Another example of reflex conditioning, birds do not eat monarch butterflies. And the reason is because they don't taste good. So one bird will eat one butterfly and be like, that's disgusting. This is the picture of him throwing up the butterfly because it's so gross. And then after this, he will have an association to no longer eat the monarch butterflies. He'll see the butterfly and he'll think, ooh, bad taste, and he won't eat that monarch butterfly anymore. It's kind of cool. There are other butterflies called viceroy, I'm not sure how to say it, viceroy butterflies that look like monarchs but taste perfectly fine. And a bird that has tried one monarch will not try any viceroys. So these guys kind of win without having to taste bad. So you might be wondering, does classical conditioning, reflex conditioning work on humans? Actually, there was a terrible scientist that we'll talk about in class named John Watson, and he did an investigation with a human baby known as Little Albert. And yes, reflex conditioning is definitely also a thing that humans can experience. So similar to classical, but a little bit different, is operant conditioning. So in classical conditioning, we took a reflex that already existed innately, and we added another stimulus to that. In operant conditioning, it's all about trial and error. And so here we've got the wolf. He's going to get zapped by the fence. He's going to get zapped by the fence. He's going to get zapped by the fence. He's going to learn through this negative reinforcement to not repeat this action. And so you kind of have to test the behavior. It's definitely trial and error. And if the behavior is bad, there's a negative reinforcement and you stop doing it. If it's a behavior that we want to continue, there's a positive reinforcement, and then that behavior will be repeated. B.F. Skinner is famous for operant conditioning, and so he built lots of these Skinner boxes, and he would have little buttons and levers inside the box, and his mice or his rats or his pigeons would flip levers, light buzzers, and if it was one of his positive reinforcements, they'd get a snack. And then they would learn to do this again and again and again. If it was a thing that he did not want them to do, that the floor of the Skinner box would give them just a little bit of a shock. And then they'd be like, nope, not doing that buzzer anymore. So these Skinner boxes definitely allowed this investigator to see lots of operant conditioning in action. So learning is the acquisition of skill or knowledge, and we are going to gain it, lose it, modify our behaviors due to this acquisition of skill and knowledge. And so kind of cool, so a couple of our things that we are afraid of, so these fears that we're born with, falling and loud noises. Think about all of the other fears that we have. And those were all learned. Those are all learned fears. We were not born with those fears, just falling and loud noises. And so my question to us is, thinking about all of these gaining, losing, modifying behaviors, is our capacity to learn greater than that of other organisms? Are we better learners than dogs, than whales, than chimpanzees? Noodle on it. We'll talk about it in class. So learning happens, and then we need to remember the things that we learn. So we're going to talk just a little bit about memory, and then we're going to call our day done. So memory is the process of encoding, storing, and then accessing information. So these three pieces, super important to memory. We're going to have some kind of external event. Our senses are going to be triggered. If we're paying attention to those senses, then we should be able to encode this information in our short-term memory. We can then sometimes also encode it further into long-term memory. If we don't encode between short and long-term memory, then we forget things. Our ability to convert this information to storable form is sometimes dependent upon our neural pruning. And so at birth, not a whole lot of neurons here. We don't remember a lot of things from when we were very little. We remember more from being 6 years old, but we don't remember everything, and maybe it's because there's too many neurons here. We're not able to encode between short and long-term memory. Usually, teenage years, we start to remember a lot more detail, more clearly, and it's because those neurons are well propagated, but also pruned and stable so that we can encode information between short-term and long-term memory. The second part of memory is that storage, and again, it's all about getting from short-term to long-term. Short-term memory is just about 1 minute. I don't think mine is actually that long. I have terrible short-term memory, which you know if you've ever asked me something and then you had to ask me again. Long-term memory can be indefinite. Those things can sit in our brains for a very, 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 very long time. And again, we have to have some kind of stimulus that causes our sensory organs to respond, send signals, and again, paying attention is super important to get that sensory information to short-term memory, and then we've got to encode to get to long-term memory storage. Long-term memory storage happens a lot in the hippocampus, so this is our transferring to long-term memory. We're going to also have that happen in the amygdala is more for the emotional pieces of memories. And then this is super cool. So the prefrontal cortex helps us remember the order of things, but not the things themselves, but what order they go in, but not what they were. We need to involve the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, to get that to happen. And then our cerebellum, this is that muscle memory. So our memories of movements happens here. So lots of different parts of the brain involved in memory. So long-term hippocampus, which is part of the temporal lobe. Amygdala here in the deep center of the brain is all about emotions. Prefrontal cortex helps us with sequences, and then cerebellum helps us with muscle memory. The final part of building memories is access. So you really have to practice remembering things in order to remember things. So that deliberate recall, trying to remember things, is super important. In classes, teachers will ask you to practice remembering things a lot, and it's because we know that recall, this practice of recall, helps you build better memories, and allows you to access that information long term. All right, so noodle on, is innate behavior or learned behavior more important for non-human animals? Which one, innate or learned, is more important for non-human animals? And then I also want to know the answer to that question for us humans. Again, we'll talk about this in class. And my friends, we are done with today's lecture. Hopefully you can define and describe examples of innate behavior and of learned behavior. You know that birdsong is both innate and learned. And then we talked about that process of making memories, and hopefully you are going to recall lots of these memories that you've just made. Good work today, my friends. I will see you in class.